All right. This weekend or this week, I did an NC30, which I had actually never worked on one of these before. It's a really, really neat bike. It's a V4 that Honda made, and this is the VFR, which is again a V4 that's carbureted with a 4-pack of carbs, but the bike had sat for quite some time and basically needed full maintenance. So tires, chain, fluids, carbs, and the forks were leaking pretty badly. So brought it back to life. It's a really neat bike. It was actually the year I was born, so I took a separate interest in the 1989 VFR400 that I did this week. But I'm going to guide through the fork rebuild very quickly. But these are the tools you need. 5 and 6 millimeter Allens are great long stemmed ones. Ball end Allens for the clamps on the top of the bars or the triple tree. 41 millimeter fork driver, 10 weight fork oil per the manual. I believe it's about 450 cc's per leg, so you can do the math on how much you need. Blue Loctite, a 24 millimeter socket for the fork cap and the front axle nut. 12, or actually it's a 14 millimeter, the bottom clamp bolt for the fork, and then assorted other tools of this nature. Pneumatic impact is great for the bottom bolt on the fork, and just to crack it loose, and then I like to just take it out slowly after that. As for the seals, I'm a huge fan of All Balls Racing. 41 by 54 by 11 for the oil seals, and 6090 for the bushings kit, and it worked flawlessly. Front wheels off, 10 millimeter heads for the front fender need to come off next. Pretty simple here, pretty straightforward. Front wheel, pretty straightforward. The caliper bolts are 12 millimeter heads. Here's the bottom clamp bolt, that's a 14 millimeter. And then you have the top clamp bolt, 6 millimeter Allen. And then you've got 2 5 millimeter Allens for the clip-on, and ball-ended Allens work very well here. One thing I am not showing here, make sure you loosen the fork cap while the fork is still clamped in the holders. It'll make your life significantly easier, but you need a 24 millimeter to loosen the fork cap before you do this. Drop the fork a hair, zip tie the clip-on to the top clamp, and don't lose this ring. It's a position ring that butts up when you put it back together to make sure everything is in place. Lightly, gently remove the fork leg. The zip tie really helps keep everything organized up top so it doesn't fall when you pull the fork leg out. And then I've got it set up in my vise. Don't lose the ring that I've already discussed. I'm counting how many rings of preload are at the initial setting. It's 3 rings showing, which equates to 4.5 turns in from fully out on his preload adjustment. So slotted screwdriver to turn it. With the fork cap already loose, this part should be easy. One hand holds the inner tube or the stanchion, while the other hand holds a 24 millimeter fork cap. Fork cap comes off, that assembly stays complete. Don't tear into that. Spacer comes out, and then your ring and your spring are going to follow with oil. So, or not ring, but washer. Washer comes out on top of the spring. This is a progressive spring. It is more tightly wound toward the bottom or toward the ground. Make sure you note that. Here's a better angle or a more clear picture of the spring coming out. Do not put it in backward. It is a progressive spring. The tightly wound coil should be at the bottom of the fork leg. Air impact with a 5 millimeter Allen to get the bottom bolt loosened, and then from there I like to transition to just a battery powered impact to back it out slowly. Sometimes you have to stick the spring back in to keep pressure on the damper rod inside, which keeps pressure on the bottom Allen bolt and will help you get it out if it's just spinning on you. But there is a crush washer, a copper crush washer on the bottom bolt, and a new one comes with the 6090 ABR bushing kit. Damper rod comes out, spring on the damper rod, and then transition to getting the dust seal off I like to just rotate a small screwdriver around the lip to get it off without damaging it. The snap ring, or the retaining ring that holds the oil seal down toward the bushings, needs to be picked out like so. It's pretty obvious how to do it. There's indentations. Here's the damper rod and spring assembly that comes out. Here's the bottom Allen bolt with the crush washer. Sometimes these crush washers are a pain to remove, so I just use a vise and an impact to get it out, or separate it, I should say. And then hammer strikes to get the stanchion out, and then make sure you pay attention to what's going on here. What I'm looking for is the oil lock piece that goes on the bottom end of the damper rod, and it's actually stuck in the stanchion, which is kind of odd. Most forks do not have it stuck in the stanchion, which it will come out. I just stuck the damper rod back in and it popped out the bottom. But here are all your bushings, washers, and seals, and then always with the big slide metal slotted screwdriver, turn 90 degrees in the slit, and it will pop right off like so. Next step after full disassembly, which is where we're at, is to clean all the components. So here we have everything cleaned up and pretty much ready to rock and roll. I'm going to be replacing this O-ring that goes on the fork cap that comes with the kit. I like to grease it here just a bit before I seat a new one, like so, with a 10mm head. They both get copper crush washers. I did not show that earlier during the disassembly, but here's all your bushings and seals lined up at the bottom. Don't forget that clip that goes back on at the end. It's an easy piece to miss or lose or forget. And like I always say in all my fork videos, make sure everything is super, super clean here. Otherwise, you're just wasting your time. You have to make sure everything is really clean when you do forks, because any foreign debris or materials just lead to either seal failure or oil wearing quicker than it needs to, or anything of that nature. So do the diligence. Here's that drain bolt that goes on the side of the bottom fork leg. Just gonna screw that in with a 10mm socket here, like so. Make sure everything's super clean here. We're gonna get the stanchion prepped nice and clean, no nicks, no problems. We're gonna flip it over and put the big slide metal on. And the way I remember this is I always oil the bushings and grease the seals. I know that different people have different strategies with this, but this always works for me. So big bushing, small bushing, washer, and Motion Pro 41mm seal driver, Motion Pro bullet. It's the blue one, 41mm. Protects the oil seal as you put it on. Oil seal numbers, letters go away from the oil. So as long as you pay attention to how it comes off, you won't mess this up, because from afar they look the same, the top and the bottom of the oil seal, but when you look at it closely, you can tell they're vastly different. As long as you're paying attention to the two different sides, you won't mess this up. Clean the damper rod, put the spring back in. They're cleaning the oil lock piece right there. That's the part that actually got somewhat stuck in the stanchion, which is a little unusual, but it pops right out from top to bottom once you push it out. But damper rod and spring goes in like so, pops out the bottom, oil lock piece goes on, captures the bottom of the damper rod, and your bushings are gonna slide from the stanchion into the outer tube or the bottom fork leg, and then we're going to transition to locking them together, the damper rod to the bottom via the bottom Allen bolt. 5mm blue Loctite. As I always say, Loctite will do the job. Absolutely no reason here to crank this thing down like crazy. I use a spring. Sometimes I use a spring in the spacer to help keep pressure on the damper rod so it doesn't spin while I'm securing the bottom Allen bolt. But yeah, you'll see my hand hold the spacer there. And I'm just pushing the damper rod down toward the bolt so it grabs onto something. All right, we'll flip the right side up here. Motion Pro fork seal driver. There is no substitute for a Motion Pro fork seal driver. There are cheaper alternatives. None work as well as the Motion Pro one. I guess runner-up would be Tusk, but Motion Pro is #1 in this category, and also the most expensive, unfortunately, but it is what it is. All right, I drove the washer and bushings down, prepped the space for the seal, drove the seal down. Going to verify we're good here. Make sure there's clearance for the snap ring to go into the groove and you're not forcing anything. Grease always helps here, of course. And snap ring goes into the groove like so. Just use a pick or a screwdriver to help push it into the channel. Make sure you hear a nice audible click. That's kind of, your audible verification that it's good to go. So for the 89K model, the spec is 450 cc's at 90 millimeters of air. I actually needed to put a little more than 450 in to achieve 90 millimeters of air, and that was after about 20 pumps, no spring, and inner tube fully compressed into the outer tube. So that spec is a little off in the Haynes manual. Remember, this is a progressive spring. All right, spring goes in, washer goes in, everything else goes in after you put the oil in and measure the oil. So the oil has to be measured before you do what I'm doing right now. Spring out, fully compressed, pumped air out, and then you measure, and then you put in the spring, the washer, the spacer, and finally the fork cap, preload adjustment assembly. I like to grease the threads. They're very fine threads on the fork cap. It makes life a little bit easier for the next person who disassembles them. Going to find a 24 millimeter socket to get that tightened down. Do your final torque on the cap once it's back in the clamps on the bike. It'll make your life a lot easier, and make sure you don't forget that little ring that sets position once you get it back into the clamps. Remember to keep everything nice and clean here. Just going to check the dampening characteristic of the fork. Feels good, looks good. All is well. Just going to push the oil seal down. Seat it. This actually seated very well, or very easily, I should say. Just clean them up. You don't have to always replace the dust seal. That's kind of up to you if you want to spend that $15, but usually you can clean them and grease them. They look brand new. And then your final step, aside from torquing down the fork cap, is to reset the preload adjustment back to where it was. So in my case, it's 4.5 turns in, which equates to 3 rings visible above the top of the fork cap. Don't forget the ring that goes in that channel toward the top of the stanchion when you reset it back into the clamps. But here you go, completed fork. Left is after, right is before. So I haven't done the right yet. I'm in this picture. It's all the parts and oil and grease. It's like I always say, it's all about doing your homework. It's all about paying attention to details, and the first time you do it is always the most difficult time. But if you pay attention, you take notes, you take pictures, you have a parts diagram in front of you, you read the process in the manual, you will be successful in performing work, assuming you have the patience, the time, and the tools necessary to do it. But bike came out pretty good, pretty happy with it. Customer's pretty happy with it, cleaned up real nice. And as always, thanks for watching.